Bastian's hands trembled as he stirred the guard's gruel. 3 months of exile in alien kitchens, 3 months of watching his culinary soul wither under fluorescent lights, while insectoid warriors devoured flavorless paste. The sacred spice pods sat untouched on forbidden shelves, crimson teardrops that whispered of ancient Cathera ceremonies he'd never witnessed. Tonight, desperation overcame protocol. Tonight, the human cook was ignored would become legend. One taste would shatter 2 civilizations' understanding of what it meant to truly feed another being. Subscribe to witness how a single recipe rewrote the laws of an empire. The crimson light of Veltarn's dying sun filtered through the spiral windows of the lower kitchens, casting shadows that danced like memories across Bastian's weathered face. His fingers, once celebrated for their precision in Earth's finest restaurants, now moved mechanically through the preparation of another batch of nutritional paste. A grey, lifeless substance that sustained the Cathera guard units, but held no more soul than the metal walls surrounding him. The irony wasn't lost on him that he who had once crafted symphonies of flavor for discerning palates now served as little more than a biological food processor in the most advanced civilization the galaxy had ever known. Each morning brought the same routine: measure, mix, heat, serve, clean, repeat, a cycle that had worn grooves into his spirit deeper than any blade could cut. The alien guards who consumed his preparations never acknowledged his presence, their compound eyes reflecting nothing but indifference as they absorbed their daily sustenance with the mechanical efficiency their species prized above all else. 3 months had passed since the diplomatic exchange that brought him here, 3 months of watching his culinary passion slowly suffocate under the weight of institutional neglect. The kitchen itself was a marvel of biotechnology, its coral walls pulsing with a faint luminescence that regulated temperature and humidity with precision no Earth facility could match. Preparation surfaces grew from the floor like living bone, reshaping themselves according to need, while storage pods lined the walls in perfect geometric patterns that spoke to the Cathera's obsession with order and efficiency. Yet for all its technological wonder, the space felt sterile, devoid of the warmth and chaos that Bastian remembered from his grandmother's kitchen, where he'd first learned that cooking was an act of love disguised as necessity. The forbidden upper levels called to him through the ceiling's translucent membrane, where he could sometimes glimpse the shadows of the royal culinary staff, moving with purpose he was denied. Those kitchens, he'd been told, prepared the ceremonial foods for Queen Zelra herself, dishes so sacred that no outsider, especially no human, would ever be permitted to witness their creation. The very thought of those untouchable realms filled him with a longing so acute it bordered on physical pain, a reminder of everything he'd lost when he'd volunteered for this cultural exchange program. His sacrifice had been meant to bridge 2 worlds, but instead he'd found himself trapped in a liminal space between them, belonging fully to neither. The morning's delivery of ingredients arrived with the usual mechanical precision, transported by servo drones that deposited their cargo without ceremony before retreating to whatever charging stations awaited them in the hive's deeper recesses. Bastian sorted through the familiar components with practiced efficiency. Protein synthesizers, mineral supplements, vitamin complexes, and flavor enhancers that bore no resemblance to anything that had ever grown in soil or swum in oceans. Each element had been calculated to provide optimal nutrition for the Cathera physiology, but the very concept of pleasure, of the emotional satisfaction that came from a perfectly balanced meal, seemed as foreign to this place as he was himself. As he worked, his mind wandered to the restaurants where he'd built his reputation, places where diners would close their eyes in rapture at the first bite of his signature dishes, where the alchemy of heat and seasoning and timing could transform simple ingredients into transcendent experiences. Those memories felt like artifacts from another lifetime, precious and painful in equal measure, reminders of a purpose that had been stripped away along with his freedom to create. The weight of his exile pressed down upon him, with each mechanical motion, each perfectly measured portion that would sustain life without nourishing the soul. The sound of approaching footsteps broke through his reverie, the distinctive clicking of Cathera claws against the coral flooring, announcing the arrival of the morning shift guards. Bastian straightened his shoulders and forced his expression into the mask of professional neutrality he'd perfected over these long months, knowing that any display of emotion would be met with the same blank incomprehension that greeted all his attempts at connection. The guards filed in with military precision, their chitinous exoskeletons gleaming under the kitchen's bioluminescent glow, each one identical in their purposeful indifference to his presence. They consumed their portions with the efficiency of machines, mandibles working in perfect rhythm as they processed the nutrients he'd prepared, their compound eyes never once meeting his own. In those moments, Bastian felt the full weight of his invisibility, the crushing realization that he had become nothing more than a function in their perfectly ordered society, a biological component no more significant than the servo drones that delivered his ingredients. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only by the soft sounds of consumption and the distant hum of the hive's countless activities. A reminder that life continued all around him while he remained frozen in this purgatory of purposelessness. When the last guard had departed, leaving behind only empty containers and the lingering scent of their alien musk, Bastian found himself alone once again with his thoughts and the endless cycle of preparation that awaited him. The afternoon shift would arrive in precisely 4 hours, followed by the evening rotation, each group as indifferent to his presence as the last, each meal as devoid of joy as the one before. He moved through the cleaning routine with automatic precision, his hands working while his mind drifted to the forbidden shelves that lined the kitchen's upper reaches, where ingredients too sacred for his touch waited in their sealed containers. Those spice pods, with their deep crimson hue and mysterious properties, had haunted his dreams since his first day in this place, representing everything he was denied, everything he longed to explore and understand. The Cathera had explained in their clinical way that these substances were reserved for the royal kitchens, their use governed by traditions that stretched back millennia, their very existence a reminder of his place in their rigid hierarchy. Yet as he gazed up at those tantalizing glimpses of possibility, Bastian felt something stir within him that had been dormant for too long, a spark of the rebellious creativity that had once driven him to greatness, now threatening to ignite despite the consequences that might follow. The day wore on, with its familiar rhythm of servitude and solitude, each hour marked by the subtle shifts in the coral wall's luminescence that served as the hive's timekeeper. Bastian prepared meal after meal with mechanical precision, his body moving through the motions while his spirit yearned for something more, something that would remind him of who he had been before this exile began. The guards came and went like tides, consuming what he offered without acknowledgement or appreciation, their presence serving only to emphasize his isolation in this alien world. As the final shift of the day approached, bringing with it the promise of another sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling of his cramped quarters, Bastian felt the weight of his accumulated frustrations pressing against the careful control he'd maintained for so long. Tonight felt different somehow, charged with a potential energy that made his skin prickle and his heart race with possibilities he dared not name. The forbidden spices seemed to pulse with their own inner light, calling to him across the barriers of protocol and tradition, whispering promises of transformation that he could no longer ignore. The evening shift departed with their usual mechanical efficiency, leaving Bastian alone in the kitchen's pulsing embrace as the coral walls dimmed to their nocturnal luminescence. The silence that followed felt different tonight, pregnant with possibility and weighted with the accumulated frustrations of 3 months spent in creative purgatory. His eyes drifted upward to the forbidden shelves, where the sacred spice pods sat in their sealed containers like crimson jewels waiting to be discovered, their very presence a constant reminder of everything he was denied in this sterile world of nutritional efficiency. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive and functional through these long months of exile, whispered warnings about protocol violations and the consequences of touching what was forbidden to his kind. Yet beneath that voice of caution, something deeper stirred, the primal urge of the artist to create, to transform, to breathe life into the lifeless through the alchemy of his craft. The weight of his grandmother's teachings pressed against his consciousness, her voice echoing across the years with the simple truth that had guided his entire career. Food without love was merely fuel, and fuel alone could never nourish the soul. Tonight, surrounded by the alien beauty of this living kitchen, Bastien felt that truth burning within him like a flame that refused to be extinguished. The servo drones had completed their final delivery of the day, depositing the standard ingredients for tomorrow's preparations before retreating to their charging stations in the hive's deeper recesses. Bastien moved through the familiar routine of inventory and storage, his hands working automatically while his mind wrestled with the growing compulsion that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained discipline. The protein synthesizers and mineral supplements felt cold and lifeless beneath his touch, their clinical perfection a stark contrast to the vibrant memories of fresh herbs and ripe vegetables that haunted his dreams. Each component had been calculated to provide optimal nutrition for the Cathera physiology, but the very concept of pleasure, of the transcendent joy that came from a perfectly crafted dish, seemed as foreign to this place as the distant earth he'd left behind. As he worked, his gaze kept returning to those forbidden shelves, where the crimson spice pods seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm, calling to him with a siren song that grew stronger with each passing moment. The knowledge that no human had ever been permitted to touch those sacred substances only intensified their allure, transforming them from mere ingredients into symbols of everything he'd lost when he'd accepted this exile. The kitchen's bioluminescent glow shifted subtly as the night cycle deepened, casting new shadows that danced across the coral walls like living memories of the passion that had once defined his existence. Bastien found himself moving closer to the forbidden shelves, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation that reminded him of his first day in culinary school, when the world had seemed infinite with possibility. The sealed containers were works of art in themselves, their crystalline surfaces etched with symbols that spoke to the deep reverence the Cathera held for these ancient ingredients, each one a testament to traditions that stretched back through millennia of their civilization's evolution. He could see the spice pods through the transparent walls of their prisons, their deep crimson hue suggesting depths of flavor and complexity that made his mouth water despite the danger of even contemplating their use. The very air around the shelves seemed charged with potential, as if the ingredients themselves were aware of his presence and yearning for the touch of hands that understood their true purpose. In that moment, Bastien felt the full weight of his artistic heritage pressing against the barriers of protocol and fear, demanding expression regardless of the consequences that might follow. The sound of his own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the kitchen's hushed atmosphere, each inhalation drawing him deeper into the spell cast by those tantalizing glimpses of forbidden possibility. Bastien's hands trembled as he reached toward the nearest container, his fingers stopping just short of the crystalline surface as the magnitude of what he was contemplating crashed over him like a wave. To touch these sacred ingredients would be to violate every protocol that governed his presence in this place, to risk not only his own exile, but potentially the entire diplomatic relationship between their species. Yet as he stood there, suspended between desire and duty, he felt the ghost of his grandmother's hand guiding his own, her voice whispering the words that had shaped his understanding of what it meant to truly cook. Mijo, the greatest sin is not in taking risks, but in letting fear steal the gifts you were meant to share with the world. The memory of her weathered fingers, teaching him to feel the readiness of dough, to taste the balance of sweet and salt, to understand that cooking was an act of love disguised as necessity, filled him with a courage he hadn't felt since arriving in this alien world. The spice pods seemed to pulse in response to his proximity, their crimson depths holding secrets that called to the deepest parts of his culinary soul. With a movement that felt both inevitable and terrifying, Bastian's fingers made contact with the container's surface. The crystalline material warmed to the touch despite its appearance of cold perfection. The seal responded to his presence with a soft hiss of escaping air, revealing the spice pods in all their aromatic glory, their scent rising like incense to fill his nostrils with complexity beyond anything he'd ever encountered. The fragrance spoke of ancient forests and forgotten ceremonies, of traditions so old they'd become part of the very DNA of the Cathera civilization, each note building upon the last to create a symphony of possibility that made his hands shake with anticipation. He selected a single pod with the reverence of a priest handling a sacred relic, its weight surprising in his palm, its surface smooth and warm as if it contained its own inner fire. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings about the magnitude of his transgression, but those voices were drowned out by the roar of creative passion that had been suppressed for too long, demanding expression regardless of the cost. As he held the forbidden spice, Bastian felt something fundamental shift within him, a recognition that this moment would define not only his own fate, but potentially the relationship between two worlds that had never truly understood each other. The preparation that followed felt like a religious ritual, each movement deliberate and reverent as Bastian began to craft something that transcended the boundaries of mere sustenance. He worked with ingredients both familiar and forbidden, combining the standard protein base with careful additions of the sacred spice, his hands moving with an intuition born of decades spent learning to speak the language of flavor and aroma. The crimson powder dissolved into the mixture like liquid fire, transforming the grey paste into something that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Each stir of his spoon releasing waves of fragrance that filled the kitchen with the promise of transcendence. The very air seemed to thicken with possibility as he worked, the coral walls pulsing in rhythm with his movements as if the hive itself recognized the significance of what was taking place within its depths. Time seemed suspended as he tasted and adjusted, his palate guiding him through combinations that should have been impossible but felt as natural as breathing, each element finding its perfect balance in a harmony that spoke to something deeper than mere chemistry. When he finally stepped back from his creation, Bastian knew with absolute certainty that he had crafted something unprecedented, a dish that bridged the gap between two worlds, carrying within its depths the potential to change everything that had come before. The soft whisper of approaching footsteps echoed through the kitchen's coral corridors, but these were not the familiar clicking sounds of the guard units that Bastian had grown accustomed to over his months of exile. These steps carried a different rhythm, a measured cadence that spoke of authority and purpose, accompanied by the subtle rustle of ceremonial garments that marked the presence of someone far above his station in the hive's rigid hierarchy. Bastian's heart hammered against his ribs as he quickly sealed the remaining spice pods and returned them to their forbidden shelves, his hands moving with desperate efficiency while his mind raced through possible explanations for his transgression. The dish he had created sat before him like evidence of his crime, its transformed appearance and intoxicating aroma a testament to the boundaries he had crossed in his moment of creative desperation. The approaching presence felt different from anything he had encountered in this alien world, carrying with it a weight of ancient authority that made the very air seem to thicken with anticipation. As the footsteps drew closer, Bastien found himself frozen between the urge to flee and the impossible hope that somehow, against all odds, his creation might be seen for what it truly was. Not a violation of sacred law, but an offering of understanding between two worlds that had never learned to truly see each other. Queen Zelra emerged from the shadows of the corridor like a vision from another realm, her towering form draped in the flowing ceremonial robes that marked her station as ruler of the Cathera hive. Her exoskeleton gleamed with the deep amber hue that spoke of centuries of life and wisdom, each segment polished to a mirror finish that reflected the kitchen's bioluminescent glow in patterns that seemed to shift and dance with her every movement. The compound eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations fixed upon Bastien with an intensity that made him feel as though his very soul was being examined and catalogued, weighed against standards he could never hope to understand. Her presence filled the space with an authority so profound that the coral walls themselves seemed to pulse in deference, their luminescence dimming as if in recognition of the ancient power that walked among them. For 214 years, she had ruled with the cold rationality that defined her species, making decisions based on logic and efficiency rather than the messy emotions that plagued lesser beings. Yet something in her bearing tonight suggested a restlessness that even her iron discipline could not entirely suppress. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with the weight of protocol violations and the impossible gulf that separated their species, while the aroma of Bastien's forbidden creation hung in the air like a bridge waiting to be crossed. The Queen's attention shifted to the dish that sat before Bastien, her compound eyes reflecting the subtle glow that emanated from its transformed surface. And for a moment that felt like eternity, neither of them moved or spoke. The rational part of Bastien's mind screamed at him to prostrate himself, to beg forgiveness for his transgression and accept whatever punishment awaited those who dared to touch the sacred ingredients of her people. Yet something in her posture held him frozen in place. Queen Zelra approached the preparation station with the measured grace of a predator, each step deliberate and purposeful, her ceremonial robes flowing around her like liquid shadow as she drew closer to the evidence of his crime. The scent of the dish seemed to affect her in ways that Bastien had never witnessed in any Cathera, her antennae twitching with subtle movements that spoke of recognition and something deeper. A stirring of memories that had been buried beneath centuries of rational thought and ceremonial duty. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of ages, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the precision that marked every aspect of her existence. Yet beneath the formal cadence, Bastien detected something he had never heard from any member of her species, a note of genuine curiosity that transcended the boundaries of protocol and tradition. "Human," she said, the word carrying both acknowledgement and question. "You have used the sacred spice of the Veltarn ceremonies." The statement hung in the air between them like an accusation, yet her tone lacked the cold fury that Bastien had expected, replaced instead by something that might have been wonder if such emotions were possible for her kind. Her gaze never left the dish as she continued. "These ingredients have been reserved for the royal kitchens for over 3,000 years, their use governed by traditions that predate the first contact between our species by millennia." The weight of history pressed down upon the moment, transforming the simple kitchen into a stage where the fate of two civilizations might be decided by the contents of a single bowl. Bastien found his voice at last, though it emerged as little more than a whisper, carrying within it all the passion and desperation that had driven him to this moment of transgression. "Your Majesty," he began, his words carefully chosen despite the trembling in his voice. I meant no disrespect to your traditions. I only sought to create something that might bridge the gap between our peoples, to show that understanding can come through the sharing of what nourishes us." The Queen's antennae twitched again, a subtle movement that spoke of processing and evaluation, while the silence stretched between them like a held breath waiting to be released. Without warning, Queen Zelra reached toward the dish with one of her primary appendages, the movement so unexpected that Bastien felt his heart stop entirely as he watched her sample his forbidden creation. The moment her mandibles made contact with the transformed mixture, something extraordinary happened. Her entire form seemed to shudder with recognition, her compound eyes widening in what could only be described as shock as the flavors registered against her ancient palate. The taste seemed to trigger something deep within her genetic memory, awakening pathways that had been dormant for generations, connecting her to ancestors who had known the true purpose of these sacred ingredients before they became mere symbols of tradition and ceremony. Her breathing changed, becoming deeper and more rhythmic, while her exoskeleton seemed to glow with an inner light that Bastien had never witnessed in any Cathera, as if the very essence of her being was responding to the combination of flavors he had crafted. The silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility, charged with the potential for transformation that hung in the air like electricity before a storm, while Bastien watched in amazement as the most powerful being in the known galaxy experienced something that transcended the boundaries of species and tradition. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a quality he had never heard before, a warmth that seemed to emanate from some deep well of emotion that her people had forgotten they possessed. "This taste," she whispered, her words barely audible yet carrying the weight of revelation, "it awakens memories that I thought were lost forever." Her compound eyes fixed upon Bastien with an intensity that seemed to see through him to something beyond, while her antennae continued their subtle dance of recognition and wonder. "In the genetic memory of my lineage, there are echoes of a time when food was more than mere sustenance, when the act of nourishment carried within it the power to bind communities together and ensure the survival of our species." The transformation in her bearing was remarkable, the cold rationality that had defined her rule giving way to something more primal and profound, as if the taste of his creation had unlocked doors within her consciousness that had been sealed for centuries. She took another sample, this time with deliberate reverence, her movements slow and ceremonial as she allowed the flavors to fully register against her awakened senses. "You have done something that our greatest culinary masters have not achieved in 3 millennia, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You have reminded us of what we have forgotten in our pursuit of efficiency and order." The weight of her words settled over the kitchen like a benediction, transforming the space from a place of exile into a sanctuary where two worlds had finally found a common language through the ancient alchemy of flavor and understanding. The transformation that had begun with Queen Zelra's first taste of Bastien's creation continued to ripple through her being like waves spreading across still water, each moment bringing new revelations that seemed to shake the very foundations of her understanding. Her compound eyes, which had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations with the detached observation of a scientist studying specimens, now held a warmth that spoke of awakened emotions her species had thought lost to the march of evolutionary progress. The sacred spice that Bastien had dared to use was revealing its true purpose, not merely as a ceremonial ingredient to be hoarded and revered, but as a key that could unlock the genetic memories buried deep within the Cathera consciousness, connecting them to ancestors who had understood that survival depended not just on efficiency, but on the bonds that could only be forged through shared experience and mutual nourishment. As she stood in the kitchen's pulsing glow, sampling again and again the dish that had bridged the impossible gap between their species, Queen Zelra felt the weight of 3,000 years of tradition shifting beneath her feet like sand, revealing new possibilities that challenged everything her people had believed about themselves and their place in the universe. The rational mind that had guided her through 2 centuries of rule struggled to process the magnitude of what was happening, while something deeper and more primal whispered that this moment would define not just her own legacy, but the future of every Cathera who would come after her. The silence that had fallen over the kitchen was broken by the soft sound of Queen Zelra's ceremonial robes rustling as she moved with newfound purpose toward the communication array that connected this humble space to the throne room itself. Her movements carried a different quality now, no longer the measured steps of a ruler bound by protocol and tradition, but the urgent stride of someone who had discovered a truth too important to be delayed by the niceties of bureaucratic procedure. Bastian watched in amazement as she activated the array with a series of complex gestures, her primary appendages dancing across the bioluminescent controls with the practiced ease of someone who had commanded technology beyond human comprehension for longer than his entire species had possessed written language. The coral walls responded to her touch, their glow intensifying as connections were established across the vast network that linked every corner of the hive to her royal presence, while displays materialized in the air around them, showing the intricate web of communication that bound her empire together. When she spoke, her voice carried the full authority of her station, yet beneath the formal cadence, Bastian could hear the excitement of discovery that no amount of royal training could entirely suppress. "Summon the royal scribes," she commanded, her words echoing through the network with the weight of absolute authority, "and prepare the throne archives for a new inscription of the highest priority. Lai." The response was immediate and overwhelming, as servo drones and communication relays throughout the hive began to pulse with activity that spoke of an empire mobilizing at the command of its sovereign. Within moments, the kitchen that had been Bastian's prison for 3 months was transformed into the center of attention for an entire civilization, as the Queen's summons rippled outward through the spiral towers of Veltan like a stone dropped into still water. The royal scribes, beings whose sole purpose was to record and preserve the most important moments in Cathera history, began to converge on their location with a speed that defied the usual stately pace of court protocol, their approach announced by the distinctive harmonics of their ceremonial instruments. Queen Zelra turned back to Bastian, her compound eyes reflecting not the cold indifference he had grown accustomed to from her people, but something that might have been gratitude if such emotions were possible for her kind. "What you have created here," she said, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy, "is more than a mere dish. It is a bridge between worlds, a key that unlocks memories we thought lost forever, a reminder of what we were before we became so focused on what we thought we should be." The magnitude of her words settled over Bastian like a mantle, transforming him from an exiled cook into something he had never imagined possible, a catalyst for change that would reshape the relationship between their species for generations to come. The arrival of the royal scribes filled the kitchen with a presence that spoke of ceremonies older than human civilization, their flowing robes and intricate instruments creating a tableau that seemed to exist outside of normal time and space. These beings, selected from birth for their ability to preserve the most crucial moments in Cathera history, moved with a reverence that transformed the simple preparation area into a sacred space where destiny was being written in real time. Queen Zelra gestured toward Bastian's creation with movements that carried the weight of ritual, her voice taking on the formal cadence reserved for the most important pronouncements of her reign. "Let it be recorded," she began, her words echoing through the communication array to reach every corner of her empire, that on this day, in the depths of the lower kitchens where no royal presence had ever ventured, A human cook has achieved what 3 millennia of our greatest culinary masters could not. The scribes began their work with instruments that seemed to capture not just her words, but the very essence of the moment, preserving every detail for future generations who would need to understand how a single act of creative courage had changed the course of history. Bastien stood transfixed as he watched his simple dish being elevated to the status of a royal relic, its recipe being inscribed into the permanent archives that would outlast the stars themselves. The formal proclamation that followed carried the full weight of Queen Zelra's authority, each word carefully chosen to reflect the magnitude of what had transpired in this humble kitchen. "By the power vested in me as sovereign of the Cathera hive and guardian of the sacred traditions," she declared, her voice resonating through the communication network to reach every citizen of her vast empire, "I hereby declare this creation to be a royal relic of the highest order, its recipe to be inscribed into the throne laws as a permanent testament to the power of understanding between species." The implications of her words were staggering. Throne laws were reserved for the most fundamental principles that governed Cathera society, unchangeable edicts that would bind her people for as long as their civilization endured. By elevating Bastien's dish to this status, she was not merely acknowledging his achievement, but fundamentally altering the relationship between humans and Cathera for all time. The recipe would become part of their sacred canon, a bridge between worlds that could never be broken or forgotten, ensuring that the understanding he had forged through flavor and intuition would survive long after both of them had returned to the stars. As the scribes completed their work and the communication array carried news of the proclamation to every corner of the empire, Bastien felt the weight of his transformation from exile to legend, knowing that his name would be remembered not as the human cook who was ignored, but as the bridge builder who had shown two species how to truly nourish each other's souls. The ceremony concluded with Queen Zelra taking one final taste of the dish that had changed everything, her movements slow and reverent as she savored not just the flavors, but the memories they had awakened within her ancient consciousness. The transformation in her bearing was complete now, the cold rationality that had defined her rule tempered by a warmth that spoke of rediscovered humanity, or perhaps more accurately, rediscovered Cathera-ity, the essential nature of her people that had been buried beneath centuries of efficient progress. When she spoke again, her voice carried a quality that Bastien had never heard from any member of her species, genuine emotion, unfiltered by protocol or tradition, flowing from a well of feeling that had been thought permanently sealed. "You came to us as a stranger," she said, her compound eyes meeting his with an intensity that seemed to see through to his very soul. "Relegated to the shadows of our society, ignored and dismissed as irrelevant to our grand designs. Yet in your exile, you have accomplished what our greatest minds could not. You have reminded us of who we truly are, beneath all our accumulated wisdom and technological achievement." The weight of her words settled over the kitchen like a benediction, transforming the space from a place of servitude into a sanctuary where two worlds had finally learned to speak the same language through the universal medium of nourishment and care. The throne room had become a cathedral of whispers, each Cathera present bearing witness to something that defied their understanding of hierarchy and tradition. Bastien stood motionless, his hands still trembling from the weight of what had just transpired, watching as Queen Zelra's attendants moved with unprecedented urgency around the crystalline throne. The recipe, his simple, improvised creation, was being etched into the very foundation of their law, each symbol carved with the precision reserved for the most sacred of decrees. The sound of chitin against stone created a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the chamber, a heartbeat of transformation that Bastien could feel reverberating in his chest. He had come here as nothing more than a cook, a human relegated to the shadows of their society, yet now he found himself at the center of something far greater than he had ever imagined possible. The Queen's compound eyes remained fixed upon him, their multifaceted surfaces reflecting not just his image, but something deeper, a recognition that transcended species and spoke to the fundamental connection between nourishment and survival. Her mandibles moved in subtle patterns that Bastien was beginning to understand as expressions of deep contemplation, each gesture carrying the weight of centuries of tradition being rewritten in real time. The other Cathera in the chamber had fallen into a reverent silence, their usual chittering communications replaced by an almost sacred stillness that made every breath feel significant. Bastien could sense the magnitude of what was happening, the way this single moment was reshaping not just his own destiny, but the relationship between their two species in ways that would echo through generations yet to come. As the final symbols were carved into the throne's base, Queen Zelra rose with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics, her towering form casting shadows that danced across the coral walls like living things. Her voice, when it came, carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the hive, each word carefully chosen and weighted with the authority of absolute rule. "Bastien Coal of Earth," she intoned, the syllables of his name taking on an almost musical quality in her alien pronunciation. "You have awakened something within us that we believed lost to the depths of time itself." The formality of her words could not mask the underlying current of emotion that ran beneath them, a vulnerability that she was allowing him to witness despite the presence of her entire court. The implications of what she was saying began to settle over Bastien like a heavy cloak, the realization that his simple act of cooking had somehow touched upon something fundamental to the Cathera's existence. He thought of the ingredients he had used, the way he had combined them, not through any grand design, but simply through instinct and the desire to create something beautiful from the mundane materials at his disposal. The fact that this had resonated so deeply with beings whose culture and biology were so different from his own spoke to something universal about the act of creation, the way that food could serve as a bridge between worlds and species in ways that words and diplomacy often failed to achieve. The weight of responsibility that came with this recognition was both terrifying and exhilarating, a burden that he knew would change the trajectory of his life forever. Queen Zelra descended from her throne with measured steps, each movement deliberate and purposeful as she approached him across the vast expanse of the chamber floor. The distance between them seemed to shrink with each step she took, not just physically but symbolically, as if the barriers that had separated their species were dissolving in real time. When she finally stood before him, her towering presence no longer felt intimidating, but rather protective, like a guardian acknowledging a treasured ward. Her voice, when she spoke again, had taken on a softer quality that seemed reserved for moments of the deepest significance. "The recipe you have created will be known as the first bridge," she declared, her words carrying the weight of prophecy, "for it has shown us that survival and beauty need not be separate paths, but can be woven together into something greater than either could achieve alone." The ceremony that followed felt like a dream wrapped in reality, as Bastien found himself being formally inducted into a role that had never existed before in Cathera society, that of Royal Nourishment Keeper, a position that would place him at the intersection of sustenance and ceremony. The other Cathera present began to approach, their movements careful and respectful as they offered gestures of acknowledgement that transcended the need for translation. Each interaction felt like a small miracle, a moment of connection that proved that understanding could exist even across the vast differences that separated their species. As the red sun outside began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting the chamber in deeper shades of crimson and gold, Bastien realized that he was no longer just a human cook serving alien masters, but had become something entirely new, a bridge between worlds, carrying the hopes and hungers of two species toward a future that neither could have imagined alone. The days that followed the throne room ceremony blurred together in a cascade of unprecedented changes that rippled through every level of Cathera society like stones cast into still water. Bastian found himself moved from the cramped quarters he had shared with other service workers to chambers that bordered the royal wing itself, spaces carved from living coral that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The walls were adorned with bioluminescent patterns that shifted and changed, according to some rhythm he was only beginning to understand, creating an environment that felt both alien and oddly comforting in its organic beauty. His new role as Royal Nourishment Keeper came with responsibilities that extended far beyond simple cooking, as he discovered that food in Cathera culture was intricately woven into their spiritual and social fabric in ways that human society had never fully grasped. Queen Zelra had assigned him a team of Cathera assistants, beings who approached their work with a reverence that initially made Bastian uncomfortable, until he began to understand that they viewed him not as a superior, but as a conduit to something sacred. Their chittering communications gradually became more familiar to his ears, and he found himself picking up fragments of their language that allowed for deeper collaboration than simple gesture and demonstration. The eldest among them, a Cathera named Veltar, whose carapace bore the intricate scarring of advanced age, served as both translator and cultural guide, helping Bastian navigate the complex web of traditions and taboos that surrounded food preparation in their society. Through Veltar, he learned that the ingredients he had used in his improvised dish were not just considered sacred, but were believed to carry the genetic memories of the Cathera's ancestral queens, making his creation not just a meal, but a form of communion with their deepest heritage. The revelation of what he had unknowingly accomplished sent waves of both pride and terror through Bastian's consciousness as he grappled with the magnitude of responsibility that had been placed upon his shoulders. Every dish he prepared now carried the weight of potential transformation, each combination of ingredients a possible key to unlocking further memories buried within the Cathera's collective unconscious. The pressure was immense, yet it was balanced by a growing sense of purpose that filled the empty spaces in his soul that he hadn't even realized existed. His work became a form of meditation, a careful dance between intuition and tradition that required him to listen not just to his own instincts, but to the subtle cues provided by his Cathera assistants, who could sense things about their people's needs that remained invisible to his human perception. Queen Zelra began visiting the kitchens personally, an unprecedented breach of protocol that sent ripples of excitement and anxiety through the entire hive structure. Her presence transformed the space into something approaching a temple, as other Cathera would gather at respectful distances to witness these interactions between their queen and the human who had somehow earned her direct attention. During these visits, she would sample Bastian's creations with a solemnity that spoke to the spiritual significance of the act, her compound eyes closing in concentration as she processed not just the flavors, but the memories and emotions they awakened within her ancient consciousness. The conversations that emerged from these tastings were unlike anything Bastian had ever experienced, as the Queen shared fragments of Cathera history and culture that had never been revealed to any outsider, creating a bond of trust and understanding that transcended the traditional boundaries between species. The other members of the royal court began to take notice of these developments, their reactions ranging from curiosity to concern as they witnessed their queen's growing attachment to the human cook and his creations. Some viewed Bastian's influence as a positive force that was bringing new vitality to their aging society, while others worried that such rapid changes might destabilize traditions that had served them well for millennia. The political undercurrents were complex and often subtle, expressed through the intricate body language and pheromone communications that Bastian was only beginning to decipher. But he could sense the tension building like pressure in a sealed container. Veltar served as his guide through these treacherous waters, helping him understand which gestures might be interpreted as respectful and which could inadvertently cause offense, teaching him to navigate the delicate balance between innovation and tradition that his position required. As the weeks passed, Bastian began to realize that his role was evolving beyond even what Queen Zelra had initially envisioned, as his presence in the hive catalyzed changes that extended far beyond the realm of food preparation. The younger Kythera, in particular, seemed drawn to the possibilities his example represented, the idea that outsiders could contribute meaningfully to their society without abandoning their own essential nature. His kitchen became an informal gathering place where cultural exchange happened naturally, as Kythera workers would linger after their shifts to observe his techniques and share their own knowledge of ingredients and preparation methods. These interactions created a new form of diplomacy, one based on shared creation rather than formal negotiation, proving that understanding between species could grow from the ground up through simple acts of mutual respect and curiosity about each other's ways. Of being in the world, the night when Queen Zelra came to the kitchens alone, without her usual retinue of guards and advisors, marked a turning point that neither Bastian nor the hive itself could have anticipated. The corridors leading to his domain were unusually quiet, as if the entire structure was holding its breath in recognition of something momentous about to unfold. She moved through the spaces with a grace that seemed almost ghostly, her massive form somehow managing to navigate the passages designed for smaller beings without disturbing so much as a grain of the coral dust that accumulated in the corners. When she appeared in the doorway of the main preparation chamber, the bioluminescent panels seemed to respond to her presence, their glow intensifying until the entire room was bathed in a warm golden light that made everything appear touched by magic. Bastian, who had been working late on a new creation inspired by Kythera seasonal traditions, looked up to find her watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. "Your Majesty," he began, setting down his tools and moving to offer the formal greeting that Veltar had taught him, but she raised one of her primary arms in a gesture that he had learned meant unnecessary formality. Duh. Her compound eyes, usually so difficult to read, seemed to carry a weight of emotion that was almost human in its vulnerability, and when she spoke, her voice lacked the ceremonial cadence that typically marked her public pronouncements. "Bastian Cole," she said, his name carrying a familiarity that spoke to the bond that had developed between them over the past weeks. "There are things about my people that you must understand if you are to truly serve in the role fate has carved for you." The gravity in her tone made it clear that whatever she was about to share would change his understanding of everything he thought he knew about the Kythera and their society. She moved deeper into the kitchen, her movements careful and deliberate, as she examined the ingredients and tools that had become the instruments of their unlikely alliance. Her mandibles worked in patterns that Bastian had learned to recognize as signs of deep contemplation, and when she finally turned to face him again, there was something almost fragile in her posture, despite her imposing size. "We are a dying people," she said, the words falling into the space between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of implication that seemed to expand infinitely outward. "Not in the way that your species might understand death, through war or disease or natural disaster, but through a slow fading of the spark that once made us more than mere insects following programmed behaviors." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy with the weight of centuries of hidden struggle and the burden of leadership that she had carried alone for so long. The revelation struck Bastian with the force of a physical blow, as he began to understand that his simple act of cooking had touched upon something far more profound than cultural appreciation or diplomatic breakthrough. Queen Zelra continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing a secret that had been locked away for too long. explaining how the Cathera had once been a people of great creativity and emotional depth, but that successive generations had become increasingly focused on efficiency and survival at the expense of the very qualities that had made their civilization worth preserving. "The memories that your dish awakened," she said, moving closer until he could see his own reflection multiplied in the facets of her eyes. They were not just of taste or nourishment, but of a time when we created beauty for its own sake, when we understood that survival without joy is merely a slow form of extinction. The weight of responsibility that settled upon Bastian's shoulders in that moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced, as he realized that his role was not just about preparing food, but about helping an entire species rediscover the parts of themselves they had lost in their pursuit of mere existence. Queen Zelra's confession continued, revealing how she had watched her people become increasingly mechanical in their behaviors, following ancient protocols without understanding their original purpose, until the very essence of what made them Cathera, rather than simple hive insects, had begun to fade away like colors bleeding from an old photograph. "When I tasted what you had created," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I remembered what it felt like to experience wonder, to be surprised by beauty in unexpected places, to feel the kind of joy that makes existence meaningful rather than merely functional." The conversation that followed stretched deep into the night, as Queen Zelra shared stories of her people's past that painted a picture of a civilization far richer and more complex than anything Bastian had imagined. She spoke of Cathera artists who had created sculptures from living coral that grew and changed over centuries, of musicians who had composed symphonies using the harmonic frequencies of their wing beats, of philosophers who had developed theories about the nature of consciousness that rivaled anything produced by human thinkers. All of this had been gradually abandoned as the pressures of survival and expansion had forced them to prioritize efficiency over expression, until they had become shadows of their former selves, going through the motions of civilization without truly living it. As the red sun began to rise outside the kitchen windows, casting new patterns of light across the coral walls, Bastian understood that his true mission was not just to feed the Cathera, but to help them remember how to feed their souls, to rediscover the creative spark that would allow them to thrive rather than merely survive in the vast cosmos they called home. The preparation for what Queen Zelra had declared would be called the Awakening Feast consumed the entire hive for weeks, as word of the unprecedented event spread through every level of Cathera society like wildfire through dry grass. Bastian found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity that challenged every assumption he had ever held about the supposedly rigid and hierarchical nature of alien civilization. Workers from the lowest maintenance castes to the highest administrative councils approached him with offerings of rare ingredients, family recipes that had been passed down through generations, and stories about foods that had once held special meaning in their culture but had been forgotten in the rush toward efficiency and standardization. The kitchen complex had been expanded to accommodate the massive undertaking, with new preparation chambers carved from the living coral and equipped with both human and Cathera cooking technologies that created a fusion of capabilities unlike anything that had ever existed before. Veltar had become more than just a translator and guide. He had evolved into a true collaborator whose understanding of both cultures allowed him to bridge gaps that Bastian hadn't even realized existed. Together, they worked to create a menu that would tell the story of Cathera civilization through taste and texture, each dish designed to awaken specific memories and emotions that had been dormant for generations. The process was part archaeology and part artistry, as they dug through ancient records and consulted with the eldest members of the hive to reconstruct recipes that had been lost to time. then adapted them using techniques and ingredients that reflected the reality of their current situation. The result was a culinary narrative that spanned millennia, from the simple fermented grains that had sustained the earliest Cathera settlements to complex molecular gastronomy that represented their technological achievements, all unified by the thread of rediscovered creativity that Bastian's influence had awakened. The guest list for the feast had grown beyond anything originally envisioned, as Queen Zelra had decided to invite representatives from every major Cathera colony world, creating a gathering that would be the largest assemblage of their people in over a century. The political implications were staggering, as many of these colonies had developed their own variations of Cathera culture over the generations of separation, and bringing them together around a table hosted by a human cook represented a radical departure from traditional diplomatic protocols. Bastian could feel the weight of expectation pressing down upon him like a physical force, as he realized that the success or failure of this event could determine not just his own fate, but the future relationship between humanity and the Cathera across the galaxy. The pressure was immense, yet it was balanced by a growing confidence in his abilities and a deep sense of purpose that had been awakened by his understanding of what was truly at stake. The days leading up to the feast were filled with a constant stream of arrivals, as ships from distant worlds brought delegates whose variations in appearance and behavior revealed the incredible diversity that existed within Cathera civilization. Some had evolved larger wings, adapted to the low gravity of their worlds, while others had developed enhanced sensory organs suited to environments with different atmospheric compositions. Yet all shared the fundamental characteristics that marked them as children of the same ancestral hive. Bastian found himself serving as an unofficial ambassador, using food as a common language to communicate with beings whose dialects and customs had diverged significantly from those of the home world. Each interaction was a small miracle of connection, as he discovered that the universal appeal of well-prepared nourishment could transcend even the barriers created by evolutionary adaptation and cultural drift. Queen Zelra's behavior during this period revealed depths of character that Bastian had only glimpsed before, as she moved through the preparations with an energy and enthusiasm that seemed to rejuvenate her ancient form. She participated directly in many aspects of the planning, offering suggestions and insights that revealed her deep understanding of her people's needs and desires, while also demonstrating a willingness to embrace change that surprised even her closest advisors. The transformation was remarkable to witness, as the cold, rational ruler he had first encountered gave way to someone who seemed genuinely excited about the possibilities that lay ahead, someone who had rediscovered the joy of anticipation and the pleasure of creating something beautiful for its own sake. Her compound eyes seemed brighter, her movements more fluid, and her voice carried undertones of warmth that had been absent during their earlier interactions. As the final preparations were completed and the moment of the feast approached, Bastian stood in the expanded kitchen complex, surrounded by the fruits of weeks of collaborative labor, feeling a mixture of pride, terror, and profound gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this point. The dishes arranged before him represented more than just food. They were vessels for memory, emotion, and hope, each one carefully crafted to serve as a bridge between the Cathera's glorious past and their potential future. The bioluminescent panels throughout the complex pulsed in synchronized patterns that seemed to reflect the collective heartbeat of the hive, while the coral walls themselves seemed to hum with anticipation for what was about to unfold. In a few hours, beings from across the galaxy would gather to share not just a meal, but a moment of transformation that could reshape the destiny of an entire civilization, and at the center of it all would be a human cook who had learned that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest acts of care and creativity. The great hall of the hive had been transformed into something that defied both Cathera tradition and human imagination, a space where bioluminescent coral formations had been coaxed into new configurations that created an amphitheater of living light around tables that seemed to grow from the floor itself. Representatives from 17 different Kythera worlds filled the space with a symphony of chittering communications, wing beats, and the subtle chemical signals that comprised their complex social interactions, creating an atmosphere that was both alien and oddly familiar to anyone who had ever experienced the anticipation that precedes a significant gathering. Bastian moved through the space like a conductor, preparing for the performance of his lifetime, checking final details and coordinating with his expanded team of assistants who had grown to include Kythera from multiple worlds, each bringing their own techniques and perspectives to the collaborative effort. The weight of the moment pressed upon him like a physical force, yet he found himself moving with a confidence that surprised him, as if all of his life's experiences had been preparing him for this singular opportunity to bridge worlds through the universal language of nourishment and care. Queen Zelra entered the hall with a processional dignity that commanded immediate attention from every being present. Yet there was something different about her bearing that spoke to the transformation she had undergone during the weeks of preparation. Her usual ceremonial regalia had been modified to include elements that honored both tradition and innovation, with bioluminescent patterns that told the story of her people's journey from their origins to this moment of potential rebirth. As she took her place at the central table, her compound eyes sought out Bastian across the vast space, and in that moment of connection, he felt the full weight of her trust and the magnitude of what they were attempting to accomplish together. The silence that fell over the assembly was profound and expectant, as if the entire universe was holding its breath to witness what would unfold in the next few hours. The service of the feast began with the simplest dishes, those that connected to the most ancient memories of Kythera civilization, and Bastian watched with growing amazement as the assembled delegates began to respond to flavors and textures that awakened something deep within their genetic memory. The chittering conversations gradually gave way to a more contemplative silence, broken only by the soft sounds of appreciation and the occasional exclamation of recognition as a particular combination of ingredients triggered a cascade of ancestral recollections. He could see the change happening in real time, as beings who had arrived with the formal stiffness of diplomatic protocol began to relax into something more genuine and connected, their interactions becoming more animated and personal, as the barriers of official distance dissolved in the face of shared experience and rediscovered wonder. As the meal progressed through its carefully orchestrated movements, each course building upon the emotional and sensory foundation laid by those that came before, Bastian began to understand that he was witnessing something far more significant than a diplomatic dinner or cultural celebration. The Kythera around the tables were not just eating. They were remembering who they had been before the pressures of survival and expansion had forced them to abandon the creative and emotional aspects of their nature. Conversations that had begun as formal exchanges between colonial representatives evolved into passionate discussions about art, philosophy, and the possibilities for cultural renaissance that this gathering represented. The younger delegates, in particular, seemed energized by the experience, their eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm that had been largely absent from Kythera society for generations. Queen Zelra rose from her seat as the final course was being served, her movement commanding immediate attention from every being in the hall, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the space with a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the living coral of the walls themselves. "My people," she began, her words carefully chosen to encompass not just those present, but all Kythera across the galaxy. "Tonight, we have tasted not just food, but the essence of what we once were and what we might become again." Her gaze found Bastian once more, and in her compound eyes he could see reflected not just gratitude, but a profound recognition of the role he had played in catalyzing this moment of transformation. The human among us has shown us that survival and beauty need not be separate paths, that nourishment of the body and nourishment of the soul can be woven together into something greater than either could achieve alone. The response from the assembled delegates was unlike anything in recorded Cathera history, as beings from worlds separated by vast distances and centuries of independent development found themselves united in a moment of shared recognition and hope. The formal protocols that had governed intercolonial relations for generations gave way to something more organic and collaborative, as representatives began making commitments to cultural exchange programs, artistic collaborations, and the establishment of new institutions dedicated to preserving and revitalizing the creative traditions that had been nearly lost. Bastian found himself at the center of these discussions, no longer just a human cook serving alien masters, but a catalyst for transformation, whose simple act of creativity had unlocked possibilities that none of them had dared to imagine. As the red sun began to rise outside the great windows of the hall, casting the assembled gathering in warm golden light, he realized that his journey from ignored service worker to bridge between worlds was complete, yet also just beginning. As the ripples of this night would continue to spread across the galaxy for generations to come, carrying with them the promise that understanding and connection could flourish even in the vast darkness between the stars.